Welcome, everyone, back to tonight's episode of Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we look at the most likely possible energies that are going to be coming up in the days ahead and are likely to affect your world and your future. First, as always, the legal disclaimer. All readings done on this show are for entertainment purposes only, but like any form of entertainment, they can be used to help you make your own decisions and your very own choices. Now that the legal stuff is out of the way, we can get on with the show. I do hope everyone enjoyed the last 2 weeks of recorded shows. I had a lot of fun doing them, and I've noticed from the listener numbers that the 6-month out predictions I did last week seem to be very popular. Now, I've heard my audience, and I will try to do more topical shows like that in the future. I especially look forward to doing a follow-up show, probably sometime around late December 2013 or early January 2014, to review the reading I did last week, and then also do another 6 months prediction out for the next year. That might actually wind up being 2 shows, we'll have to see, but I'm really looking forward to that. I had a really great time in London, and in addition to going to book signings for someone else and enjoying a great camp out where I got to do a class in general divination, I was also able to get a recording and an interview with my friend Freya Oswin, who's one of the world's leading experts on runes. And we're going to be hearing that in the second half of the show. So don't go away. You'll really want to hear that particular interview. But first, we've got a few weeks of catch-up and review to do on the readings that we did in the shows before I went on my trip, and also that happened the readings that took place while I was gone. Now, tonight, I'm going to actually go back 3 weeks in reading the cards, rather than just the 2 that I read for during the last 2 shows. And that's because the way events have chosen to work themselves out, I really think that June 17th forecast is probably the most important one in terms of both recent and current events. That's the reading when I found I had 2 cards stuck together, and I didn't even realize that there were 6 cards instead of 5 until I'd laid them all down. Now, at the time I said, now we get the really weird card. And that's why there are 6 cards rather than the usual 5 in this reading. After I had laid out all my cards, I realized there was a card actually stuck to the back of the Father card. When I removed it and set it down, it proved to be the Beast. So that's what I said at the time, and I realized that what we really had was, and I mentioned, a sort of Beast and Father card together, which along with the runes for fortune, skills, death, and the Raven, and the Ice Rune and the Thorn, made for very likely a very stuck situation that suddenly exploded, possibly caused by the winds of fortune or the powers of fortune. And they sort of centered around this figure that I called the beastly father, or the father that was the beast. Now, things actually looked so bad that I actually went out on a limb and predicted a conflict. One caused by this beastly father that occurred when something that had been terribly stuck, it was unmoving, that's the Ice Rune, the Isa Rune, it suddenly was pricked by the Thorn Rune that we also had, and it exploded. And there was a highly likelihood of death and destruction as the result of these events. And they were likely to be seriously influenced by those who held great fortunes, or perhaps, as I said, perhaps the winds of fortune. Now, I speculated at the time that the father might be Russian President Putin, since in the old days the Tsars of Russia were often called the Little Father, and that perhaps it involved the Middle East, with Syria being the most likely place for such actions to start. Well, I'm bringing this up to both discuss matters of timing in readings, and how the cards and runes are usually correct, but how it can be very difficult for a psychic or any sort of interpreter to figure out exactly what the target is without either having like a vision that tells you this is what it is, or a much more tightly worded question than we're doing when we just say what are the most likely energies of the week. Because we get the energies, but then I have to sort of try to guess around as to what they're about, because we don't have time the way we would in a longer or more personal reading to say, okay, so where would that conflict be, or what sort of would it be, and break it down. And because I've just reviewed this reading for tonight's show, and I realized that the energies were exactly correct, Well, I had just reviewed this reading for tonight's show, and that's when I realized that the energies were exactly correct. That there was, in fact, a beastly father, a man whose country he had been trying to use his skills to freeze in place, whose political situation had stagnated, and whose continuing control and power was truly affecting the fortunes of both his people and also setting a lot of folks with great wealth and power, both in his area of the world and on the greater world stage. The Thorn Rune did, in fact, prick the situation, which then exploded into a nightmare in the Middle East. So the region was correct. One that is not over, but continues as I'm recording the show on Saturday, July 6, 2013. But the head of state was not Putin of Russia, nor was the Middle Eastern country Syria. The beastly father who went too far was in fact the now former President Morsi of Egypt, whose Muslim Brotherhood party had tried to use their skills, the skills card in that reading, to bring about a theocratic Muslim state, which even if it was democratically elected, it went from being a positive role model of like father to his country, in this case Morsi himself, to a raging beast of a father, when a huge portion of his people decided they didn't want to go the route he was going. Now, I'm not saying the man himself was personally a terrible monster. That's for history to decide. But I am saying that in this particular situation, both his and his party contemporaries' attempts at turning back the clock to the days of the Caliphate, basically religious rule of the secular state, resulted in a more beast-like behavior, especially when he's backed into a corner and starts saying things like he would rather die than leave, which of course, at least at this point, he hasn't died and he has been removed, but there was that cornering behavior. Now, the Death and the Raven, the Dark Messenger card, they still seem to be playing out. These energies haven't totally left. And they still seem to be playing out in this state of sort of near civil war that's existing in this Middle Eastern country, now that the ice is broken. You know, the thorn pricked it, and the conflict has started. It's just not where I expected it to be. So things did pretty much happen as the cards and runes predicted, but as I said, they just weren't where I thought they would happen. Now, there are still a few bits to be cleaned up before we go off of this review, and I want to mention them. First, we don't know yet, and it may be years before historians are certain, just how much, if any role, Russian President Putin, or in fact Syria, might have played in the current Egyptian crisis. So it's possible that as a psychic I was picking up on some of the overall patterns that were going on behind the scenes, or I just plain got it wrong when I used my conscious mind to try to sort out what I thought the most likely subjects were in this reading. And it's just probably going to be a while before that becomes clear one way or another. Also, the fortune card in this reading really gets complicated, because it's well known that Saudi Arabia, a place of great fortunes, great oil money, and also known to fund a lot of things that go on in the Middle East, was not happy with the way things were going in Egypt. Now, the reasons behind that are really complex and political and deep, and we really don't have time to go into them on this show, but you can Google it and look up the history if you're really interested. There's a lot of information out there. But in addition to the fortunes of the Saudis, so that we've got that coming in, we also get the idea of fortuna or fate or the luck of the now former president and his government getting somehow, they didn't have very good fortune. Their fortune waned. And we also get the concept of the great fortunes that I mentioned in the original reading 3 weeks ago, of banking elites, industrial, corporate world players, who may find this conflict, or perhaps an even larger one that it might kick off, or perhaps this one is a precursor to, they may think of it as a way to improve their fortunes, or they could in fact lose fortunes. But basically, fortunes are at stake and they are all over the place. Finally, many individuals in Egypt are going to find a change in their personal fortunes, some of them for good and some of them for bad, but it's all going to be part of this ongoing mess as long as it continues. So to sum up, right information, but slightly off timing, though things were building at the time I did the reading, and definitely the wrong country, even if it was the correct region of the world. Now, having taken so much time with the reading from 3 weeks ago, I'm going to briefly go over the high points of the 2-week reading that followed it. The basic theme of which was a relatively calm period at first that was shattered about halfway through with an explosive hail strike that was that Hagalaz rune. Not necessarily real hail, but a sudden event that would seem to come out of nowhere. So the week before, we have ice and something stuck that is broken open by a thorn. Then we have a period of calm that's followed by hail, actually, or water in ice form striking from above. Again, not always in literal water, but that image. There were also hints about the sage, a wise old man, and the voyage. Remember, the cards and runes read energies that make things likely to happen at a certain time, especially in these sorts of overall readings where we're not targeting anyone or anybody specifically except the world itself. Now, I noted 4 situations where this energy seemed to play out over the last 2 weeks. The one we've already looked at was the sudden explosion in Egypt, which seemed to many people to come out of the blue, that Hagalaz rune, or the thorn rune that pricks it. I know that being in the sunny UK, where people were enjoying summer, and the sudden shock of the rioting and hearing that 14 million people were in the streets of Egypt, it really was a really big surprise. The second occurrence, I think, was the sudden and horrific firestorm and the death of so many young firefighters in that tragedy in the United States. That caught everyone by surprise. An elite fire team that was trained to deal with a dangerous situation is just suddenly overtaken and dies in nearly the blink of an eye. It's such a big story, it's even the front pages of the Irish news. Fire itself is not caused by hail, but it's caused by its sister, the lightning. So again, we have these very cosmic, sudden striking forces. Sudden, deadly, and a very unfortunately unhappy expression of this kind of energy. The third situation we had was at the end of this same time period in the U.S., an entire town gets 1.5 feet of actual hail, actual Hagalaz, falling on the ground and making headlines throughout the world again. So here we have Hagalaz in its most basic form. In other words, first it kind of hits symbolically, and then as if to make the point, wham, it smashes down. Finally, on a totally different track, I felt all of last week that the Sage card and the Voyage card were best being expressed by the slow fading away of the South African President Nelson Mandela, who at this reading is still with us, but is obviously setting sail for his final voyage. No matter what any individual may think of the man personally, the archetypal image of the sailing ship going off in the distance, followed by a card with a white-haired old man on it, and the final Dagaj rune, that sun at dawn, I think they're just such a perfect expression of an elderly statesman, a sage and beloved to many of his people, journeying out of this life and on to the next one. Is just such an obvious expression of those energies. It may not have been the only one. Other people may find some examples, and feel free to send them to me at my website. I love feedback, but that was really the impression I got. Now, this thinking of going off into the sunset and onto the voyage, onto the next realm, is a perfect lead-in for the coming reading for this week, where we will once again ask the question, what are the most likely possible energies affecting the world this coming week, July 8th through 14th, 2013? If you're following along with me at home, which you can do by going to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com, and click on the cards for this week's show, the first thing you will notice about this card spread is that even to the untrained eye, this does not look like the quiet, restful summer break those of us in the Northern Hemisphere usually expect about this time in the season. In fact, we have some rather serious cards that suggest the previous week's chaos and surprises may not be over. Though hopefully, we may now be in a bit more prepared frame of mind to meet them, because some of them I think are already ongoing. But let's talk about each card a bit and then see if we can look at some overall patterns and project outward what may be coming down the road. Okay, so first we have the libido card. This card shown up before. It's a lovely card with two peacocks displaying their gorgeous colors for a peahen. You can't actually see her on the card, but you know she's off there because they're doing their dance thing. There are flowers and a waterfall, deep green grass, but the grass itself hides a snake that the peacocks are too distracted to see. On its most obvious level, this card is about sexuality, temptation, and the creative forces. The card is what gives life and color into life. But it's also about deception and distraction. Not seeing a danger that is right there under your feet because you're too busy engaging with someone or something else. I think this distraction, or perhaps tempting of fate, we see in the libido card is important because the next card is destruction. In this deck, it's not the Tower of Destruction, as it is in the regular tarot deck, but it's rather a destruction in general, but it's a church and a castle wall being besieged under fire. Armies clash, and there is a darkness and blood. A Catholic priest holds his holy book as he is shown dying or perhaps already dead in the foreground. Well, this card shows up for all sorts of destruction, including the creative sort of destruction that needs to happen before something better can replace it. Like taking down a ruined building in order to build a new one. If you don't tear down the old one, you don't have a new place. So destruction can be good. But this card is also a perfect depiction of the collapse of both church and state. There's a small image of a person being hung and even burned at the stake, again suggesting persecution of faith, or at least miscarriages of justice, while an innocent horse lies stuck dying in the battle. Again, a total innocent animal destroyed by the fortunes of war and by what his masters are doing. Well, this card is not just about secular versus faith-based conflicts. It is this version of destruction the author of the card has chosen to pick. While the images seem to be right from the European wars of religion around the 16th and 17th centuries, they could be about any time or any place that reason gives way to emotions and then violence and emotions take over. This already explosive combination of sexual creative forces and destruction now meets with the wheel card. The wheel card is similar to the same card in the regular tarot deck, where it appears as the Wheel of Fortune or the Wheel of Fate. However, I've also noticed that particularly in the side card deck, in addition to its usual meanings of something being fated or how the Wheel of Fortune is playing out, it also tends to stand for the cycles of history or even karma. In other words, it can mean that a cycle is playing out both historically and or possibly based on what's been done in the past that has consequences that are now rolling forward just into view. At the very least, the wheel card indicates that whatever the libido destruction combination actually is, it's fated and likely to occur. The wheel itself, it may turn in a variety of directions, but the basic energy is likely to play out in some fashion, and there's probably very little that human beings can do to stop it. The last two cards are Liberation, which is a couple fleeing a castle dungeon on horseback, and the castle tower itself. I'm reading both of these together because they're linked, with Liberation suggesting that something has been free by the explosions of the libido and destruction, and the castle tower suggesting that other forces are lining up to defend against whatever is being let loose. When I was putting down the cards, the first three cards were all next to each other, and then I sensed a sort of break. So I reshuffled the remaining cards and then pulled the last two, so they were not in the last two were in sequence, the first three are in sequence. There felt like a natural break in the energy or a pause of sorts between that third card and the fourth card, And that's exactly what we see in the reading. Pretty much the crisis occurs and the wheel spins, or shall we say the cycle revolves. And that's part one. Part two occurs slightly later, when people sort of start to breathe, and there's a reaction to the turning of the wheel breaking free, and it breaks free of something. For good or ill, we don't know what is released, but something just breaks out. But then there's a defensive reaction that occurs against it. And this is pretty normal. Usually when, like if the child starts to run out of the room, you try to grab it. It's a very normal sort of push-pull. But in this case, it feels a lot more powerful than that. The rune staves give us an indication that this might, I mean just might, be financial, with Fehu, the cattle, wealth, sex, fertility rune being the first rune stave. However, when you take that with a libido card, Fehu can as much be about sexuality and creativity as it is about actual economic fortunes. However, again, given the last few weeks' repeated warnings and influences of money, fortune, wealth, economics, this could very well be a time when distractions of temptations of really shiny, pretty things that don't matter much, really, prevent people from seeing a sudden destruction or turning of the wheel when it does come. A turning of a cycle which could easily involve money, fortunes, banking, finances, stocks, etc. If this isn't directly about that sort of obvious money, fortunes theme, then it's likely to be affected by it. I also feel a very strong sense that the destruction card is partly about this basic conflict between faith and secular society. And I don't mean just in Egypt, but in other parts of the world as well. And that includes faith that some economists may have in like a great hand on the market that will reach down and automatically balance anything, except when that doesn't happen. In fact, I think this is about blind faith in many forms. Just pretty much anything that lets people, individuals, tribes, world leaders, countries, even corporations or bankers, anybody, to just keep pretending that everything is fine. This basic faith that everything is okay as long as I focus on my distractions. Well, there may be violence and other issues increasing in the background, and meanwhile that wheel just kind of keeps on turning. Finally, we do have some hope, thank goodness, in the Berkana rune, that is the birthing rune, the rune of the birch tree and the mother goddess, even Mother Earth herself. Now I have to say there is a darker side to this combination of Fehu and the birch tree, especially with the libido card. And that would be the breaking loose or birth of wild forces, possibly sexual, possibly monetary or creative, that proceed to run over the more usual nurturing aspects of this birth rune. However, on their own combination of Fehu, which literally means cattle, and Berkana, which is, again, birthing in birch, it's a pretty good combination on its own. It suggests both wealth and protection, or the protection of wealth. Given the other cards, though, my guess is that this is a week when wealth, and even perhaps human birthing sexuality, really does need that protecting, rather than the other way around. Stories you could expect to see in the news with this sort of overall reading are continuations of the situation in Egypt, perhaps even spreading to the rest of the Middle East, problems or new discoveries about human fertility, genomes, population issues, even genetic engineering, especially in terms of destruction of fertility. And the same would be true of the situation in Fukushima or in Japan, or other places where things again affect human fertility and human reproduction, or perhaps even human sexuality and a way it expresses itself. There are also likely to be stories about economies, currencies, stocks, etc., breaking out of old patterns and suddenly running into new ones. That could include precious metals, anything that appears to be monetary or economic. Now, these could adhere in either direction. They could be going wildly off, getting in one direction, or wildly off in another. But it does look like defensive actions will be taken after this occurs to try to mediate whatever the breakout is, if it actually is in the monetary or currency area. finally, there may be stories about people or populations breaking loose in various bids for freedom. And again, I don't just mean in Egypt. Egypt is just sort of this great cosmic example right now we have that where things are obviously playing out this energy really strongly. And it may not be a totally physical phenomenon either. This could be reaching out for freedom in a variety of ways. You're likely to see stories about everything from riots to new forms of music or creative arts that may break new ground, that give birth to something new. This is also included in that creativity libido rune that we don't want to forget about, and that's the really positive libido energy, this desire to make new things. But again, each action towards freedom is likely to result in a serious defensive action taken against it, in the form of that great towering castle blocking their path, or at least trying to block it. Now, remember, the castle can also be a good defensive. It can be a good defense against enemies or things which are a threat. So we can't totally say that this reaction of the castle is a bad thing. It all depends on what that breakout in liberation is. If it's something very scary and something that ultimately is something we need to worry about, then having that castle defense is exactly what you want. But if it's actually something positive, then the castle becomes a negative force trying to block it. Given the complexity of the cards and the running patterns from previous weeks, I shall not be surprised if some of this destructive, rather epic, and cyclic energy takes more than just a week to play out. I think, like we saw before, it may take several weeks to really express itself completely. But we know that this week it continues what was going on after our brief lull in the action, so to speak, 2 weeks ago. And it looks like it's going to continue to be a rather intense period of time for a little while yet. Thankfully, individuals can use that Berkano and Fehu rune together on their own as attractors for good energies in terms of the nurturing safety of birth and mothering, and the wealth, love, relationship, and just expressive aspects of Fehu. However, just be aware that Fehu on its own can signify fights over money and sex, which is another aspect of this reading, particularly with that libido card, and one which on a personal level you really want to avoid in your own life. Knowing that this is a possibility this week, you can be careful with the feelings of your loved ones and with your family finances. With that wheel card, this can be a real tipping point for individuals as well as nations, and you want to be sure that personal wheel tips in a positive and rewarding direction, that you get the relationship and the money and the economics and perhaps the job or whatever that you're looking for, not a reversal of fortune. You want the wheel to move in the direction that's positive for you. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see how the next 2 weeks, just how that wheel does spin, and what it is it breaks loose beneath its wheels, especially, I think it's more on an international level. Although, again, people will experience in their own life a breaking out in many ways. And again, you want that to be a positive breakout, and you want your defenses to be helpful and useful, not something that blocks something that you really wish to happen. But for now, I think that that's enough on this reading. I think we can pretty much examine it again later. So I think it's time to sit back, breathe, and take this show in a totally new direction. Instead of a personal reading tonight, we're going to have a very interesting personal interview with friend Freya Oswin, who will take us away from current events and all this crazy energies flying around and into the ancient realm of the runes and the rune staves. So stay tuned, as that interview will be coming up right after these short messages. All the music used on the show today is from musicalley.com, your source for free-to-air music for podcasts. The artists place their music up for free to air in hopes that you, the listener, will visit their site and purchase some of their outstanding musical offerings. So after the show, why not visit musicalley.com and explore their extensive playlist?
And she sings, she goes home in the evening with the dew all on her wings.
Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
See me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland. See me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland.
Hail day, hail sons of day, hail night and new moon. With the piercing eyes look hither, and grant us victory while we live.
Today, we have a really special presentation for you. My friend and world-renowned rune master, Freya Oswin, is going to teach us a little bit about the runes and give us a little bit about the background. Because I can talk a lot about the Psi cards, and I've mentioned that Psi cards are kind of a modern system of divination, but the runes are a lot older and they have a lot of interesting background. So I'm going to turn it over to Freya, and she can tell you something about it. Freya?
Yes, the runes probably became known and developed sometime between the 1st century and the end of the 1st century Common Era. Some rune signs are older than that individual rune signs and have been found all over the place, from Indo-European settlements to new grains in Ireland. They also appear in Navajo paintings and voodoo vases, which proves that the signs, the visual pictographic signs themselves, are a universal part of the collective unconscious of humanity. But within a Germanic context, they also became letters and a tool for divination. Some elements of runic writing are almost certainly derived from Mediterranean alphabet. Roman, Greek, and North Italic have all been discussed as hypothetical models. Others from the Bronze Age stone signs of the Germanic people. Their use and understanding, however, are solely Germanic. They have been processed through the Germanic mind, integrated with the Germanic mythology, and used as tools of magic, suitable also for memorial and operative inscriptions when used for magic. They were naturally known as the gift of Odin. Odin won the runes through a shamanic initiation of fasting and that of an Yggdrasil, through which he reached down to the deepest roots of the origin of the cosmos to draw up their holy pattern, the pattern of will. The oldest runes known to us are those of the Elder Futhark. Futhark is the runic equivalent of alphabet, derived from the first 6 runes: Fiu, Urus, Thurisaz, Amzus, Vraido, and Kena. A 24-rune pattern divided in 3/8.
Freya, if I can interrupt you for just a second, for the benefit of my audience that's from all over the world, you mentioned the word Germanic. Can you kind of explain what you mean by Germanic and what the Germanic world is, in your opinion, or historical background? What do you mean by the word Germanic?
The Germanic tribes around the Roman era of Tacitus, and the Scandinavian people as well. There are in the main 3 or 4 divisions of Germanic languages: East Germanic, West Germanic, North Germanic, and the old Proto-Germanic or Gothic. From these interactions between these tribes, the runes somehow developed, and there is 2 ways we can look at that. The exoteric way, where the runes are originally pictographic representations of sound. Presumably, They could go back to Neolithic origins, where people recognized the sound and made a scribble to express to other people what they meant before literacy actually was developed by humans anywhere. And from there they became an alphabet. They got syncretized some way with the Mediterranean alphabet, Greek, Roman, Latin, and acquired a letter value. My opinion is that this is a late development. And to me, the runes are, first and foremost, a key to sound, encapsulate certain creative sounds, 24 creative streams from the universe. And from that respect, on an esoteric level, I think the runes have always been there until they manifested themselves predominantly through the Germanic people's culture. And when I mean Germanic, I'm talking about Germanic in the sense of what the Romans described. I am not talking about modern Germans. Let's get that out of the way first.
Well, you mentioned that they're a kind of sound. Could you maybe give us a demonstration of one of the sounds?
Yes, I can, but my voice is pretty much buggered after yesterday's recording session, so bear with me. Now this sound feels like an out-breath of the universe, the first current of sound, which then anchored into the matrix of the Earth's magnetic field, linking in with the sound of the Earth, the old Earth. So, cosmic and Earth, the sounds. The first two sounds are of a creative origin. They then gave birth, so to speak, to subsequent sounds, like
Wow, that was really interesting, Freya. And I know that there are a lot more runes, but we're going to save your voice because I know you were recording a great deal later. And in future shows, we hope to have you back. And maybe we can talk more about individual runes and the sounds and their meanings. But before we go, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but if you could just help my audience understand maybe how the runes made this transition, or in your opinion, from being an alphabet and primordial sounds of the ancients to something we can do divination with today.
how they developed, how does any magical system develop? Somebody dives in the well, picks it up, start working with it, teaches other people who teach other people. And so a data bank on the inner plane is built up with associations. Basically, in a similar way as the Kabbalah, really.
One of the things that I've noticed is that where I think you can do divination with just about anything. You know, if you can make up your own system if you want to.
You can do divination with cat litter.
Yeah. And well, I think I'll leave that to my cat for now. But I know that I read mostly psi cards, which are a newer system. But I notice that when I read runes, I seem to be tapping into something that's somehow older. Whereas the psi card worked really well for, like, if somebody wants to know about, should I take this job or not? I find the runes to work a lot better for things like, what is my life path? Or is a storm coming and will it be destructive? Things like weather or great thoughts or the great motions, the cycles of history. And is that, do you think that's because they are so much older that they've just maybe experienced more?
Yes, that is one reason. The other reason is that the psych arts are a modern invention based on Jungian psychology, and wonderful as they are, I can't work with them because the rooms are connected with a specific spiritual force, an egregore, known to us as gods and goddesses. So when you work with rooms, you're not just working with the sigils to do readings or predict or extrapolate current events into a probability future. You're actually plugging in to a sentient mind of a specific god or goddess, which makes them a bloody sight deeper, more involved than any other divination system.
So you would recommend that people who want to work with runes, even if they're not necessarily heathen or pagan, they should study the Germanic gods and goddesses and get to know the world from which the energies from which the runes come from, correct?
Yes, they should study at least the cosmology and the gods and goddesses in the myths. And not confine themselves to Snorri either. They don't have to become Asatru or heathen, but everybody who does rune readings is well advised to invoke Odin or the Norns before you start and thank them afterwards. It's just common respect.
Well, thank you very, very much, Freya. This has been really interesting and a great introduction. I know you're tired, so I'll let you go for now. Freya, by the way, spent all day yesterday recording for, I believe it's going to be, is it a concert or an album?
It's a concert, and there will be, if everything goes to plan, there will be a DVD with the whole concert on it. So yes, it's an album, but it's not a CD, it's a DVD.
Well, we'll be having more information on that when it comes out, and we look forward to that. And for now, I want to thank Freya very much for being on our show, and thank you.
Thank you, Melody. I really enjoyed that, and in the words of Arnie, I'll be back.
We look forward to that, Freya. Good night.
Good night.
If you would like more information about Freya Oswin, her rune classes, books, and private rune readings, please visit her website www.oswin.com. That's www.aswyn.com. A really great place to explore the northern mysteries and magical traditions. Well, that's our show for tonight. I hope you enjoyed both the current events readings and our very special interview with Freya Oswin. Stay tuned next week, and we'll be back Monday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future. See you then.
Well, here's a health to the company and one to my lass.
You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a glimpse of the energies coming soon into your world and into your future. Be sure to join us again next time when we explore another chapter of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Again. Well, here's a health to the company and one to my lass. Let's drink and be